KnockBack, the retro and nostalgia podcast, is brought to you by, well, you. If you want to learn how to support our show, go to patreon.com/laststandmedia. Greetings and salutations. Welcome back to KnockBack. My name is Colin Moriarty. I'm joined as always by my brother Dagan, the warrior of light, Moriarty Dagan. Thank you for joining me today. How are you today, my friend?
Gil, get the money. Dollar bill, y'all.
What's going on, my friend?
What's up, my dude? The craziest shit has been happening to me. I don't think I mentioned this to you over the last week. We recorded on Constellation. We did, I think it was Ben's topic. We talked about dreams. And I talked about in that conversation how I feel like I have very little autonomy over my dreams. I have very little control seemingly over what goes on. But once in a while, I'll be able to wake myself out of a dream, realizing it's a dream. Sometimes a good dream, sometimes a nightmare. But that's kind of as close as I get to having any sort of semblance of control over my dreams. Lately, I'd say every night since we recorded that show, I have these really strange dreams. They're not unpleasant dreams, just regular. They're not super sexy, amazing dreams, fantasy dreams. They're not dark nightmares in any way, just regular dreams. Me and one other person. Last night it was Helene, where somewhere in the throes of the dream, the conversation, whatever's going on, I say out loud to the other person, come on, this has to be a dream. And again, it's not because anything great or terrible is happening. It's just, for some reason, that's how the conversation goes. And the other person is obviously in on it, but doesn't want to confirm or deny it's a dream, but kind of playfully giggles. In other words, not letting on that they kind of know. And I'll say to them, come on, is this a dream or whatever? And then I remember in last night's dream, I didn't even want to say it because I was afraid Helene was going to think I was crazy for saying that. And then puff of smoke, all of a sudden I wake up. It was a dream. It's the strangest thing. And I was thinking about this morning making coffee. And I think it's actually kind of a fortunate turn of events for me, because I think what's going on is my career anxieties are playing out in my dreams, but not in the typical way you would think your anxiety would play out in your subconscious while you're sleeping, in nightmares or, waking up in cold sweats or jumping up with your heart palpitations and things. I'm having these really odd dreams where I finally have a lot of control over my dreams, but it's very random because they're not really pleasant dreams, and they're just a regular, very pedestrian, almost seems like life, but in my dream. It's just an extension of a day-to-day thing. Chores, conversations, doing this, doing that. It's the strangest thing. But I would say the last 6 or 7 nights. And it's always a different person. Maybe it was Helene a couple of times. It's always me and one other person. And it's always me calling it out. And then feeling, you know what the other thing is? Have you ever experienced this? Just looking around in your dream to try to figure out some clue to confirm or deny if you're dreaming or if it's reality. And in the dream, not being able to figure it out. Like really, I don't know. I can't tell. And looking around at details on the wall and the other person sort of giggling like I'm being punked in my dream, and then having to wake up from it. But again, this could be playing out, the anxieties could be playing out a lot worse. So maybe I should just count my blessings, right? And go on. It's kind of a little entertaining, actually. I'm always eager to go back to sleep now last few nights and see, is this going to happen again? And it does every time. It's the strangest. I've never realized this kind of potential with my dreams. I'm thinking maybe I could take it to the next level. Maybe I go into a pleasant dream, right? Maybe I realize it's a dream but could stay in there. I don't know. We'll see where it goes.
So I asked you how you were, and you gave me a 4-minute story about the dreams you're having, which was interesting in and of itself. Appreciate that. Fair enough. Well, I mean, yeah, we talked about that on the show. I mean, I have fucked up dreams too, but so I hope you're well, maybe you're not very well rested then.
I think that's another thing. I'm not sleeping as good, and maybe that's the effect where, yeah, I'm almost going back to 20s, not 1920s, my 20s version of Dagan, where I just slept 3 or 4 hours a night. And that's a confluence of being busy and anxious. I think it's more being just having a lot going on right now, type of thing. It's not necessarily a bad thing. But what about you? How are you doing? What's going on in your life?
I have nothing new to report, really. Busy. We're recording actually on Mother's Day.
Indeed.
I'm going to Mom's in a little while later to hang out.
She's
I'd say to
having
have
the
dinner, but they
shindig.
eat dinner at like 4 p.m. And I go to these family functions out and I just don't eat because I'm just
Oh,
like,
you don't
I'm not
eat?
hungry. I don't want to fucking eat at 4 p.m. Like, sorry,
You're going to
but
take
I'm happy
a
to hang
plate.
out with everyone. You know,
Take
be
a
fun.
plate home.
Nah, we usually go to McDonald's on the way home.
You know what I wanted to ask you real quick?
Yeah.
We'll jump into the conversation, but I wanted to ask you how golf went on
Good.
Friday, a couple
It was
days
good.
ago.
Yeah, I have, horrible form, but it's fun. Golf is fun to me because I usually use like what would it be, like a 3-iron, I guess? Or is it 3 wood? I don't know which one's which. The fat one.
Don't ask
And
me.
I look, because that's like kind of a mid or like a little bit of a bulbous. You get a lot of power out of it when you hit the ball or whatever. Just comical amount of power.
400 yards.
I'm stronger than I think I am because like there are once in a while where I just bash a ball and it goes, I don't know, 150 yards or something. Maybe not that, 150 feet, I would say. It's not yards. That would definitely be like Tiger Woods.
No, it might be. You might be able to hit the ball
I don't
100
think so.
yards.
It reminds me when I was a kid and we used to have a bucket of old golf balls at Mike Pope's house and we would take him to the field and then hit him with baseball bats. And they would just fly. Like you would not even know where the fuck that thing went.
You'd never find that.
It was so fun. Like I'm sure you like sometimes you hear and then you like listen for a few seconds and you're like, boo, like hit someone's roof or whatever.
Did you guys play 18 holes?
No, we just drove.
Oh, okay. Oh, that's cool. Oh, okay. Oh, I misunderstood. Okay.
You don't want me on the golf course.
That's a whole nother other.
I mean, it can be done. I've done it, but it's not good.
No. LSM golf outing would be very entertaining now that I think. I
actually think golf's a great game.
Me too.
But I'm not good at it. I'm also a lefty, so it was funny. They like set us all up, and then they have a bunch of like a smorgasbord of right-handed clubs out, and then they're like, "Is anyone a lefty in your group?" And I'm like, "I am," and they have to bring you like a bag with left-handed clubs.
Go into the shed that they never go into.
And I looked up and down. There are hundreds of people there, like in these different groups or whatever. And I think I only saw one other guy hitting lefty the entire night.
It's that rare?
Which is so weird because I always wondered why it wasn't rare in baseball, but because people say left-handed, especially left-handed throwers, there's so many of them in the MLB because they're needed, not because they're natural.
Right.
So if you're a left-handed pitcher of some quality, you have a much better chance of making it in the MLB.
Sense. Absolutely.
Yes. I wish I knew that when I was a kid, when I was throwing 50-mile-an-hour heaters. All right. Let's get into the topic, my friend.
All right.
It's a good one. It's Final Fantasy I. Now, as I said, and we said on a previous show, and I've said on Sacred Symbols, the intent here over the next year or so, I think we can probably do it, is maybe even less, is I want to do 6 Final Fantasy games. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We already did 4 very early in the run of KnockBack. We did it in 2018. However, that's an audio only version of the show. It's probably an hour and 10 or 20 minutes long. I didn't even play it for that. We have different kind of rules now. We don't. Hey, thanks, man. We don't record 6, 8, 10 at a time anymore like we did back in that day, so we can prepare more. And because I used to go to Dagan's, or Dagan would come to Santa Monica and we would just record for a few days and then we wouldn't do it again for a few weeks or a few months. And it was I think the show is much better now. So I picked out these Final Fantasy games because the Pixel remasters had come. I think I actually have the date here on my notes. 2021.
Yeah.
They came to iOS and to Steam, and they're pretty bad versions of the game. They're totally the same games we're playing now, but they have the horrible text boxes and just a lot of things. So for the Pixel remasters, which came out in April of 2023 on Switch and PS4, so playable on your PS5 as well, they released the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 a la carte and as a group. And I thought it would be fun to go back and check on these games, especially because 4 and 6 are amongst my favorite games of all time. But I actually think all 6 of them have something to say and something interesting, and just thought it would be a good topic for KnockBack. I also think you've never played Final Fantasy 1.
Not before this, my friend.
So it's interesting. Now, the version that we're playing is, and I'm sure you maybe looked, and you might remember, markedly different in some way graphically. I would say the game on the NES or the Famicom, really, when it came out in 87, was much more like Dragon Quest in it's had all these boxes around the screen, but it was right to left instead of front to back. So Phantasy Star and Dragon Quest would have you fighting forward. Final Fantasy made it so you fight sideways, which is obviously its hallmark all the way through, I don't know, 10, I would say. So
sure,
it's interesting that it starts here, but it's fun playing it. So I was familiar with this game as a kid. I had it. later. And I think, not even like you, because you moved on to Final Fantasy II first, or 4, what was really known. But I was a big Dragon Warrior fan. 1, 2, 3, and 4, which was Dragon Quest in the United States. It was called Dragon Warrior at the time. And I've been into these kinds of role-playing games since early on. And what I texted you when I played it, I beat it a couple of weeks ago on PS4. I platinumed it. But I was just like, this very traditional, cozy, familiar game. And it's funny because I can see a game like this and people being like, what is this? Like, why is this fun? It's the old joke that goes around of like JRPG gaming, and then it's just a picture of like an Excel spreadsheet, because it's all just numbers and turns and stuff like that. But for some reason, I really love it. And I had fun with this. I think that the new trappings of it, I have to go back and look, but I think this is much like the PSP version of the game in some sense that came out in 2007. That's the last time I played it.
Oh, wow.
The game was on PS1 in 2003. That was the last PS1 game I ever bought. It was Final Fantasy Origins in the spring of 2003. GBA came in 2004. I don't think I had that version. I had 4, 5, and 6, I want to say. And then yeah, the PSP version, and then this version as well. And in addition to the original NES version. And it's fun to think that, and I think I have this right, that there's like 2.5 years between, very old school, 2.5 years between the Japanese release and the American release of this game.
Mm-hmm.
Also a big Nintendo Power game and all that.
Yes.
But I'm just curious, what did, top thoughts, Final Fantasy 1, what are your thoughts here?
I remember this from a 1990 perspective. I didn't play it. I didn't even own it. I'm not sure we even knew anybody who had it. What I remember about it was my friends at the time a few of them had older brothers who were real D&D marks. They were probably, some of my friends are my age, some of them a little younger than me, but most of these guys, the older brothers, were 3 to 4 or 5 years older than me, super nerdy. And they were not only super engrossed with D&D, but they were playing games like Ultima and Exodus and Wizardry. So I would see on the PC and stuff like that. So I would see from afar, those sort of text-heavy, text-driven, very, monotonous, seemingly really boring computer RPG games. And that, always reminded me of like, okay, these guys are D&D nerds. These guys are big Lord of the Rings marks. They're just engrossed in anything that has to do with this kind of stuff. But they were also playing games on the NES, like Legacy of the Wizard, The Immortal, Dragon Warrior, of course, the Zelda games, of course. And then they were playing, I remember them picking up this game and sort of watching it from afar. Every time I go to my friend Adam's house, his older brother Sean might be playing this. And yeah, to me, it took on that very early on. It took on that sort of role for me from afar of, okay, this is kind of boring. It reminded me of the early PC games, which really tainted my view of PC games back then. They seemed very plodding, very dragged out, with they seemed intimidating to me or / mundane or boring. And I always kind of thought of that. But what I do remember sort of being stricken with was that those early Nintendo Powers. I had to look back to realize it was Nintendo Power issue number 12, which wasn't on the cover, but it had an 8-page illustrated sort of overview. It wasn't a strategy guide. It had some screenshots of the game, and it had this really gorgeous, striking, high-quality illustration, which even going back now, I can't tell if it's Eastern-y sort of manga or if it's Western-style art that's just a little more sophisticated, but really beautiful artwork, watercolor artwork of the game, of different characters in the game, different NPCs, maybe different monsters or different town settings. Really gorgeous. And then later on that year, I think in 1990, if I'm not mistaken, it was Nintendo Power issue 17, which was a full-on strategy guide for the game. And I remember reading the issues of Nintendo Power, even between issues number 12 and number 17, Kyle. I think there were a couple of more issues with Final Fantasy specific articles or brief walkthroughs, partial walkthroughs and stuff like that. And I remember being like, oh, this is kind of neat. But at this point, I had never played an RPG, even though I think Legacy of the Wizard came out the year before. The closest I had gotten to this point was Zelda, because I didn't even pick up Dragon Warrior / Dragon Quest in the 8-bit era at all. I still haven't played the 8-bit Dragon Warrior games. So I had no RPG / JRPG knowledge at this point. And I was familiar with fantasy as a genre, but not in the video game realm. So I was always attracted to it from afar, from a visual standpoint, but I had never played. So it was really nice going in and sort of getting that inflection point, going back to the not so humble beginnings of this epic franchise. And of course, like you, I echo that sentiment. Final Fantasy IV and 6/2-3 are some of my favorite games of all time. I have a really special place in my heart for 4, so I can't wait to do that one again with you on video this time. But this was really nice to go
much
back.
deeper way than
we'll cover the shit out. That game specifically deserves it. But playing this, Kyle, I played the Pixel Remaster like you. I played on Switch. I paid the $75.
Good deal. By the way, great deal.
I think it's fine.
I want to say this real quick.
Yeah.
A lot of people, I say this a lot on Sacred, I know, but you get what you pay for. I don't understand how else to say this to people. Gaming isn't supposed to be free. It's not supposed to be even cheap. If you want quality games and all this, and I know people are saying it's a collection of old games, and I'm like, guys, it's hundreds of hours for $75, including 2 of the best games ever made.
That's a great point.
Stop.
It
just infuriates me. I just don't know what people expect. Everyone's like, games are horrible and they're getting the worst and they're so risk averse. And I'm like, oh, really? They're risk averse? I wonder.
It reminds me of skateboarding. The price of skateboards, skateboard decks, skateboard wheels, skateboard trucks, skateboard completes, whatever, was the same price for 30 years before it had to eventually go up a little bit. So I think it's totally fair. I do hear a lot of price criticism with this Pixel Remaster collection, specifically not even buying the individuals, but the bundle. But I think putting it in terms of quality, you actually absolutely make a great point. One thing I did that was funny though, Kyle, I played a few hours into the Pixel Remaster, quickly realized, okay, this is the 16-bit version, right? We don't call it that, but that's kind of what it is. Let's be honest. And then went back and popped this baby in. For those watching, not watching, I'm holding out the Nintendo
Is that mine?
cart. I think it is. Do you remember if it had this? Yours had this label damage?
Yeah, that is mine. Yeah, because
right?
I bought it on eBay.
I was like, was this Collins or?
Yeah,
was
I bought it on eBay. It was damaged. I think I probably got it like back. I mean, this is incredible for people to think about, but I probably bought that in the late 90s on eBay, literally for probably like $2 or $3.
Oh, I believe it. That's crazy. Yeah, it has a little Blockbuster sticker on the back.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the one.
I was like, did I get this in a lot? Because I never sought out to buy this, or was this Kyle's? So now we know.
Yeah, I never owned it until I went back on eBay and bought a bunch of things in the 90s, which is so funny because I was like 13 years old, 14 years old. Also, I was telling someone recently that you used to have to pay, before PayPal, you used to have to pay your eBay fees by check, and I just never paid them.
Yes, that's right. Oh, you never did?
No, never. For years. I mean, I paid the people I was buying from, but I never paid eBay. They just it was very much like the Columbia House CD thing. Ramon and I always talk about how I did that 3 or 4 times when I was a kid, accumulated probably 60 CDs in that, like literally, and then just never paid, and just never. And that was everyone did that. That's why those record clubs never worked. But I was just thinking, like, there were such strange things you were just able to do. Like,
it's
I was just
not
like,
even a loophole.
Do you remember it was like 14 CDs for 1 penny? Remember that kind of thing? And I'd be like, okay. And then I would like get all these CDs and then I just.
It is amazing. How is that a sustainable model with so many people taking advantage? But what I wanted to say was, I popped this in about 3 or 4 hours into the Pixel Remaster, and holy shit, man. This game does not, especially graphically from a cosmetic standpoint, this game does not age well. And let me just tell you, this would take a very special younger person to play this now. I know I always say, I'm always kind of grudgingly saying, I'm very traditionalist. Go back and play the original. Do we need the Pixel Remaster ever? I think playing this Pixel Remaster of FF1 really put me over the edge of like, I get it. I get why you have to remake it and upgrade it and sort of plus it for newer generations. Because I can't picture a 25-year-old playing this game, let alone a now 12-year-old. There's just no way. I honestly think it would take a very special individual boy or girl to play this original version. So I think playing the Pixel Remasters now over the last week or so have taught me that, okay, yes, I've come around on that sentiment. I understand.
Yeah, NES Classic had it. I wonder if a lot of younger people messed with it or if it was just turned off to them. Because I know SNES Classic had 3, as we
That's
knew it.
right.
So I wonder if people sat down and played it. It's funny, you'll appreciate this, Dave. The last time, it might be that cartridge actually, and I think I replaced the battery on that cartridge, but I don't remember.
Oh wow.
That the version I had, which I think is that cartridge, when I bought it, its battery died when I was in college and I was playing it. I would try to get as far as I could without, like, I would get like to the pirates or something like that, and then I would meet some untimely end. And I just remember that so well because it wouldn't save, because the battery was dead. So I think you probably have a freshie in there. Well, it's 15 years old now, 16, 17 years old.
Yes, Funko Land era. I understand the graphical upgrades. We'll talk about and possibly argue about the gameplay upgrades and whether I think those are worth having. But of course, you have the option. You could play it traditionally. You could play it with all the newfangled bells and whistles and make it much easier.
Yeah, you can make it easier. You can make it trivially easy, which is interesting. But that's not different than people that played Final Fantasy VII, 8, 9, the PS4 ports of those games will know that they added probably even crazier shit in those. Like in 7, I platinumed 7. I played 8 a little bit and I'm like, nah. And I gotta get to 9. 8 I do want to get back to because 8 I was always soft on 8.
I like 8. I really like that game.
Yeah, I think when I was playing, I'm like, I don't know. I gotta remember. For instance, when I go back and play 10, it takes me about 5 seconds to figure out why I hated it when it came out. In it takes no time at all. I probably played 10's first few hours, maybe 6 or 7 times, where I'm like, I just can't do this. I can't do it. I just don't. But 8, I don't remember. I think I was a little bit bummed about, like, I don't know what it was, like the gun sword or something, some weird 10th grade hang up I had. I don't know what it was.
Dude, it had to follow 7.
Yeah.
I feel bad for it. 8 had to follow 7. You have to remember that. Like, it didn't, that was a tough, still to this day, toughest act to follow. Maybe ever in video games, right? Not just RPGs, not just specifically franchise. Ugh. And I like how different it is. I like that, they took a very Nintendo-esque early to mid Zelda departure where it was like, we're going to make this a lot different. And by that, maybe it'll, it won't elicit the criticism that could come from trying to do 7 again, which you can't.
Right. And in fact, I think we'll get to Final Fantasy II shortly, maybe even next episode. I have no idea because that's a short game too. We can just get through that. But 2 and 8 have some sort of connection with each other where they both fundamentally changed the combat. And a lot of people, like, you'll see with 2, Final Fantasy 2 is all about, like, I think you get like defense and hit points by getting hit more. I think your attack goes up by using, which makes a lot of sense in some sense, but it's not Final Fantasy. And 8 did the whole draw system.
Yes.
Where it's like you had to steal your attacks and your spells and stuff, which is
and items.
I don't know. Yeah, it's interesting, but anyway, we'll get to 8 in the coming years.
8, yeah, sometime.
So I wanted to get back to this. I was reading a little bit about Square, and I forget. First of all, it's so funny because the Square we're talking about doesn't exist anymore. It hasn't existed in 20 years, but Squaresoft at the time was an interesting company. I mean, I think they did Rad Racer and like all this weird stuff. Their first game was a game called Death Trap, which never came out here, but that was a text adventure. So they had no real bona fides in role-playing games. They worked with Nihon Falcom really early, the guys that do Trails of Cold Steel these days, and did an action RPG. That was the first RPG they published. And they messed around with some role-playing elements, but it was really, I think, Wizardry and probably even more Ultima that convinced them to do this. And then I think Dragon Quest is what ultimately set them over the edge by thinking that it could possibly work. And you can see, again, like, I think you can tell that they were inspired by Dragon Quest, but tried to change it so that they wouldn't be copied. And again, that goes from like the side to side as opposed to this. Like, just little things like that you can tell are different. Having a party instead of one person, which Dragon Quest would later do. I think in Dragon Quest 2, you have multiple characters.
Yeah.
So they tried to do things a little differently, and I respect that. But this game, I think it's pretty novel. I try to think about it through the lens of history, I guess it were. What were people's expectations? The game came out in the winter of '87 in Japan. Again, we didn't get until the spring of 1990 in the United States. And it's so funny because then we got Final Fantasy II probably not even a year later on SNES, so it was coming quick. And then they actually finished. There is a finished ROM of Final Fantasy II NES that just never was released. I think because they thought it was all fucked up. Yeah, it's actually there's even I think versions of it collectible because it was at CES I think playable. And then they just never released it. And I think there's ads for it too. I think that's why they named Final Fantasy IV Final Fantasy II. And we're just like, we'll just move to the SNES.
Okay.
And just move on.
That
Probably a smart move. I actually think Final Fantasy II I think some people would look at a suspect, and I wonder if that would have killed it in the crib in some way. So maybe an interesting move, because Final Fantasy IV obviously just lifted the entire veil of what a role-playing game can be. But I wanted to know, do you see it the way I see it, these games? Like, the reason I really love pixel art, and the reason that I love these kinds of 8-bit, 16-bit, even 32-bit role-playing games, so you can go even up to Wild Arms or something like that, or Tales of Destiny, is that they're beautiful, but they're not graphically fine enough to show you what's really happening. When I play a 3D game, so I'm playing the game Forspoken now, which is like a Square Enix game from Luminous Studios, the guys that did Final Fantasy 15. It's actually better than I think a lot of people are giving it credit for, but the one thing that's bad about it is it looks like shit. Mm-hmm. And it's in a 3D, it looks like shit. And it's in a 3D world, boring, sterile 3D world. And since you're in it, there's nothing to imagine. This is it. And I think Final Fantasy I and games like it bridge my love of tabletop role-playing games. And I did grow up playing D&D. Unlike you, I did embrace it from an early age. And my feel of wonder, I guess, in that from a young age, I always looked at it as saying, like, this is a representation of what is happening. This is like playing Dungeons and Dragons with, you'd play Dungeons and Dragons on paper, and then you could step it up, right? You could have like a map. And then you could step it up and you can have like figures on the map and movements and all these kinds of things. This seems to be like several evolutions beyond that, where it's like, okay, now you're in a world, you don't have to keep track of your stats, which actually I would love to do, but obviously that wouldn't work for a game. That's part of what's fun about Dungeons and Dragons for me, but it's tracking all these things. It's all this deep mathematics and dice rolls, but it's just a facade over it. And so when I see the party going into a wooded tile, it's like, well, they're on the wood line of a forest and they're walking into it, and a random encounter, though they're annoying the people, you have to look at it as saying, like, they're not going from this town to the boat on the coast in 5 seconds. It's a representation of what's happening. So twice along the way they get attacked by enemies. And I think if you have that kind of, I think people that, I don't want to put it quite in these terms, but it almost feels like people that like role-playing games like this dwell in the realm of imagination, I think, a lot more than people who need more just kinetic action and graphical representation. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that either. And I love, from this period, dead up love a lot more action games than I do this game. So I'm not saying that, the whole Mega Man series, the whole Castlevania series, the whole Ninja Gaiden series, I take all of those over this.
Sure.
But there's still something tremendously imaginative about it. And through that historical lens, you can see how this game was really intriguing. I mean, it sold hundreds of thousands of copies in Japan. Those guys were really just used to playing, Wizardry was kind of still new, but they were really used to playing Ultima, especially on, like, there was NEC PCs and all of that. And that's where Squaresoft came from. So I think they actually had a mind for it already. I also think European gamers had a mind for it already, Ultima and all of that as well. I actually think the United States is probably the place where this took people by surprise the most. And so anyway, I've said a lot there. I'm curious if you feel that sense of wonder. Do you identify that that's what's interesting about these kinds of games?
Yeah, it's well said the way you broke that down, Kyle. It is all based on imagination. It really is. And I think it was easy for Gen Xers to adopt this because it goes back for me to something like Atari, for instance, which really did require a certain brand, a certain flavor of imagination, I think, to play those games and appreciate them. I always think back to the James Rolfe Angry Video Game review of Atari games, and he's talking, I think, specifically about Atari bowling. And he says you play as a square, rolling a square down a rectangle to hit a bunch of little squares, and it's like you had to, from a 1979 perspective, we had to imagine that as a bowler in a bowling alley, a smoke-filled bowling alley that smelled like beer, and you're rolling a bowling ball down and the sound of the pins. But it was these very simple graphics with about 2 sound effects, this half-bit game. And I think what I love about really well done 8-bit and specifically 16-bit games is they're somewhere in between really primitive games like Pong and Atari 2600 and modern games contemporary 2023 games, which I love. I love the graphical sophistication and the animation quality and the oral wonders that we could do now. But the 8-bit and 16-bit generations, I find I'm really drawn to them because it's somewhere in between. It's something where you're looking at things that are representative and clear, but there's still some sort of modicum of an imagination that you have to put into it. And I'm such a mark for this specific thing, especially looking at Final Fantasy I and sort of turning it with a pixel remaster into the 16-bit realm, because it's cute, it's cartoony, it's expressive, you got the chibi graphics, but you could still get a lot out of that. And then whatever's left over, you could just use your imagination for, like you're saying. And not just with the graphics, not just with the sound and the music, but like you're saying, with the gameplay too. And the amount of time that's elapsing versus using your imagination to say, obviously they didn't get from, the southern coast to the northern desert in 3 seconds. But again, you're using your imagination to impart your knowledge of how this would play out. And I love what you said too about Western audiences specifically, and the Japanese specifically, video game companies, software companies capitalizing on our burgeoning love for D&D and fantasy. And of course, the way that played out of love for Tolkien and Lord of the Rings and all that kind of stuff, it was sort of a nice dovetailing and a nice timing, and it really captured a nerdy sensibility and put people's love for the books and love for practical tabletop gaming into the digital computer realm. And then, of course, later on with console gaming that went beyond the PC. But definitely, I'm such a mark for this still. It doesn't really wear off. This generation of games, I think, requires imagination to play, but it also required a lot of imagination to make these games. And I think that speaks to me too, from an artistic and creative standpoint, where, you didn't really have all the tools and bells and whistles that you have today to make something photorealistic or really get your point across like you did back then. I think it took a certain level of thinking that I still appreciate. And I think that makes it timeless for a lot of people. And I think that's why you could do a pixel remaster and charge $75 for it now. And a certain amount of people are going to buy it, and enough for it to be successful and for it to have been worth it from a corporate standpoint, because there's something special about this generation that really it's an in-between period. It's something that sort of bridged the gap between really primitive and really modern gaming. I think it's a real sweet spot in gaming that I think always speaks to me. I'm so excited that we have five more to go. By the way, 3 of which I still haven't played. Right? So
2, 3, and 5, would be. Yeah.
Right, exactly.
3 is when I think 3 is very, very interesting, because that's when the game gets really big. And 5 is probably the seminal class-based game where you can choose your classes. So I'll be interested to see what you think when we get to those. But yeah, I think you touch on a lot of interesting things there as well. And yeah, definitely taking advantage of the rise in fantasy, which is so funny. Like the whole post-war, I guess it really began before World War II, but certainly with Tolkien and all of that, after World War II, it really took on a life of its own into D&D. And it's just interesting how it was a very niche thing, and very, very seminal people kind of helped proliferate it. And so you could argue that a game like Final Fantasy or Dragon Quest or even Phantasy Star tells, I don't want to say the less imaginative child, because I don't think that's true, but some people are even embarrassed to play role-playing games because you kind of have to act a little bit, and some people don't understand the dice rolls, and the rules could be a little bit complex and all of that. And it's kind of saying to them, we do all of that. So here's at least the core gameplay. But the gameplay is different because there is something really hefty about throwing dice and just seeing what it says. And there is something about just pressing the same button over and over again, especially if you're fighting just lame enemies and you don't really need to do anything. So yeah, there's no balance here. And I want to talk about that because I think the game is unbalanced and easy in a lot of ways, but it's just the beginning of what's to come later. And it's amazing that there's really only a few years between what they would do with this and then what they would do later with 4 and 6. It's not a huge amount of time between those games. They did them quick. In fact, I think Final Fantasy II, the real Final Fantasy II that we'll do next, was made in like 9 months or 10 months. I mean, like unthinkable amount of time. And I think Final Fantasy IV was made in something like 14 months or something. It's just,
that's incredible.
Yeah, I just don't understand how that's even possible.
That's insane.
Okay, so let's talk about the beginning of the game. One of the hallmarks of the game, of course, is the classes and the 4 characters, the heroes of light, seeking crystals and assistance of this goal to rid the world of chaos. And the story doesn't really matter. I mean, is there anything about the story or the characters or anything that resonate with you at all? I really don't care at all about the story in this game.
Yeah, it's kind of arbitrary. I mean, very surface level fantasy game. I mean, kind of as the game evolves over the course of the storyline as it plays out over the however many hours it takes you to finish. The story is remarkably deep for a game of this generation, just from a company standpoint of thinking that would be worth it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally.
But the evolution, now I don't know about 2 or 3, but certainly by the time we get to 4 and of course later 6, how deep the story would get in terms of not only the storyline, but the characters and falling in love with the characters and the personalities and how deep they got with that. This was sort of an inflection point and a start to that, but very surface level, nameless heroes, typical bad guys, not a lot of texture, not a lot of gray area, very black and white as far as good versus evil, and really just kind of a vehicle for the game. And of course, later on, starting for me with 4, that would change dramatically, where I think 4 is one of the best stories told in any video game to this day. Mm-hmm. And some of the most lovable, memorable characters. But this one, if you already know all that, then for us, it's like, okay, well, this is where it started. And then they would grow that to some sort of degree. But I would be probably pretty impressed had I played this as a 16-year-old, thinking of this is a lot deeper than nearly any 8-bit offering, maybe with the exception of things like Metal Gear, where there was sort of a, and of course we're dealing with Kojima in that case, where there was enough of a story where at least it was, rudimentary, but there was some sort of semblance of a story there, at least to keep you in the game and to keep you in that headspace and all of that. Nameless heroes, but you care about them, and you meet NPCs along the way, and there is a storyline at different parts of the world being affected and afflicted by this evil. So very black and white, and of course it would evolve, but it was enough to satisfy me over the course of it. It took me, you'll laugh at me, get ready to giggle at me here, 25 hours, I think, to finish this game. Wow,
that's crazy. Yeah, the game is not, maybe you let the clock run at some point or something.
I might have let the clock run here and there, but I didn't. I tried to play as traditionally as possible. I didn't really do too much auto battle.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, I let I went in for the random encounters. I'd have it no other way. But of course, I took advantage of things like dashing and moving diagonally and some of the quality of life upgrades, of course, make the game a little less mundane.
Yeah. And I don't think the dashing might take into it. The dashing, I don't know. I didn't pay attention to it too much. When you dash in some games, it actually it's moving you the same amount of tile spaces. So it increases your encounter rate. So yes. In other words, I don't know if dashing actually makes the game easier for you, if it just makes it seem like it's easier for you, in other words.
That's a really good point. It's a placebo almost.
Right. But I didn't mess. So we mentioned it earlier. The quality of life features, I think, are fine. Oh, because that's why I mentioned Final Fantasy VII before about quality of life features, because you could just have yourself totally maxed out with your limit breaks over and over and over and over again. That's really breaking the game. Yes. So this allows you to simply turn off encounters or make them more likely, and then mess around with experience and gil, or your currency that you get. So you can make it like 4 times. You can make it even half as much if you want to make it more challenging for yourself. So I didn't do any of that stuff, but I did do like the auto battle when I was just fighting random things, like to I would just fight, defend or whatever, and then just let that go, because I think it took me 12 hours or something like that, and I platinumed it.
Half.
Yeah. So I did everything. I opened every treasure chest, fought every enemy.
Oh, you platinumed it as well?
Yeah.
No, I didn't even do that.
Because it's pretty straightforward. Like, it's going to be much harder to play the future. Well, not 2, but 3, 4, 5, 6 are long games. Yes. I am curious, because I think with the speed effects of Final Fantasy VII, you can do it in like 20 hours, which is very quick, but that's because you're moving quicker.
Sure.
So, anyway.
That makes sense, yeah.
But the quality of life updates for the pixel remasters, for those that are going to play on PS4 or Switch, which I highly recommend, they're great. The bestiaries are super cool.
Yes.
The maps are super cool. The maps even show you where the treasure is missing and all that, so you can know where things are.
Love it.
The stat screens are all different. You can use the new soundtrack or the old soundtrack, mess around with graphical effects and all that. So, yeah, I dig it. I wanted to shout the QOL updates to that as well. But let's talk about one of the seminal parts of this game, as we mentioned, very beginning of the game, which is classes. I think this is the first role-playing game that we would get on console that would do this. And this is the beginning of a great Final Fantasy tradition of class, which really permeates to this day, especially in Final Fantasy XIV. But that we come to love in both its malleability and in its non-malleability. So you think about a game like 1 or 3 or 5 where you can change your classes, and in 5 especially there's a shit ton of classes. Of course that bleeds over into a game like Final Fantasy Tactics, but then you think about a game like 4 and 6 where you have classes but you cannot change them. So Porm and Palom are mages, Edgar uses tools, Sabin uses kung fu. There's no changing that, but they're still class based. Yang is your monk, and so on and so forth, right? So I dig the whole class permeability thing. I like picking your classes too, but I don't mind being presented with characters that have their own classes as well. In fact, I prefer that these days. But going back to this and its non-linearity, no story, kind of the bare bones foundation of what would become Final Fantasy, I think it's pretty fun. The problem, Dagan, to me, and this is a big problem, is that the game is unbalanced to a degree where you really, and I only realized this and remembered this when I was playing it, was that there's almost no reason to have magic users in this game, right? Like it's actually kind of at a disadvantage, maybe a red mage or something, but I had knight or whatever, warrior, monk, fighter, white, black, right? And and that's what I was saying before, fight, defend. That was my auto battle constantly, because the magic system, which was not the way I don't think it was done in the first one. I have to go back and look, but the counting the magic the way they did, I think there was MP in the first one. I have to go back and look. I don't remember.
I think so too. I think you're right about that.
So it made it feel much more limited in that sense, but I did try to choose a well-rounded party nonetheless. And I love one of the great old game facts things and like early internet things was trying to get through Final Fantasy with really ridiculous parties, like all white mages or whatever. And there are walkthroughs, like very specific walkthroughs on how to do that. And I do love that customization.
That's so cool.
That's found here. That is not found in really any of the other Final Fantasy games, even the ones with classes, because they're too long to fuck around with like that. So, yeah, I'm wondering what you thought about the classes, what classes you chose, and if you found that kind of lack of balance as well, because I was a little disappointed in that. I felt like I was kind of just playing with two characters most of the time.
Yeah, I think that's well said. I really like the class system and the job system of assigning your characters. Of course, as I mentioned, I like the named heroes with personalities that we'll get starting for me with 4 and later on in 6, where you get these characters you could really fall in love with. But it is very clever to take that D&D sort of beloved aspect of D&D that everybody goes in for, which is like building a character and building your own custom party of characters. I went with the stock default, I think this is how it is in the game, of fighter, thief, white mage, black mage.
Yeah, that is the default.
Right. Because I find each of those classes really irresistible. Now going in, though, if I did a second replay, I'm really enamored with the red mage, which I didn't realize that was sort of a white mage meets black mage. And of course, the black belt, which of course later on will fall in love with Yang. But because the black belt is so overpowered, I watched a couple of quick clips of Let's Plays, and I was like, holy shit, this guy's taking away like $1,200 worth of damage on boss characters and stuff. It would have been really cool to use him.
HP.
Oh, yeah, the HP. But, the thing is, it's interesting. I think everything you said is true, but I think what comes down, for me, I like to play as traditionally as possible because I want my JRPGs to be tough. I cut my teeth on 4 and 6, games like Wild Arms. Those were hard games. They were long games. They were slogs. You had to pay attention. You had to upgrade. You had to pay attention to your party status, get the right items, the right armor, the right weapons, keep up to pace with your leveling up. And, it was really an adventure, and it could be hard and you could fuck it up. You could go into a dungeon or a specifically hard boss encounter and die and have to go back and start over. So I wanted to keep it as traditional as experience as possible, because I think what happens is these pixel remasters, as wonderful as they are, they're just too easy. There's just, you find yourself very, very infrequently do you feel like you're in any sense of danger, or if there's any peril in losing or having to go back or repeat a half hour or, God forbid, 2 hours of gameplay. That was what made JRPGs so interesting. They were chess. It was a chess game.
Yeah, like here's a save spot, or like save on the world map. Go into the dungeon, and then you would hope to find a save spot in there somewhere, basically.
Absolutely. or just be ahead of the curve and think, okay, I have to save on a different slot before I go in here. So if I fuck up or do something wrong, I could always go back to where I was, no harm done. That type of thing. This is just too easy with the quick save and being able to save anywhere and everywhere. In the middle of a dungeon, you could save. Again, I understand it because it broadens the appeal for people, and the cost for entry is a lot lower because you don't think, oh, I wasted so much time, or there's no frustration moments of throwing the controller and all that thing. But again, that was the draw for me with traditional JRPGs. That's why I played them compared to other genres of game that I love, like a shoot 'em up or an action game or a fighting, a 2D fighter. I loved JRPGs for that because it was a different experience. It was combat and it was story, but it was also really management, leveraging a little bit of your OCD and really treating it like a chess game, building your party. And, eventually we could change out members, not in this game, but we could change out members of our party and really kind of employ that level of strategy that I love. This was just too easy. I think you could, I could see making a party of at least 3 white mages and being completely fine in this game. And again, not even being that great at JRPGs, but being, I guess, good enough or steeped enough in the origins of JRPGs to know, all right, I have to make this at least a little bit challenging for myself, or it's a little too much of a cakewalk. That takes away the whole joy of a JRPG for me. So even an early one. So, but I basically enjoyed it. I would definitely build my party differently now. And you know what the other thing was? I had a proxy for the party I chose. The fighter I just saw as the leader. That's inevitable. You kind of need him in there. I just thought of my favorite works of fantasy. LOTR, Record of Lotus War, the Dragonlance Chronicles. There was a proxy, Wild Arms. I saw the white mage as Cecilia.
Oh, Cecilia. I saw you put that on Twitter, and I don't think anyone got it.
Nobody got that. That was the only one. Nobody got that one.
It's so funny because that was the only one I knew. I was like, oh, Cecilia,
and the black
mage.
mage. Come on, the design of the black mage. How can you not have him in there? Look at him.
Iconic. I mean, that is one of the most iconic. I would, if you spread out to the top 25 icons of video games, like things that it would probably be in that. Because obviously you have your star from Mario and your mushroom and your Triforce and all this. But I think that would be in there, is like the black mage with his hat and like the face you can't see, the almost Jawa-like face.
So good.
It's awesome. And I love I don't know if they do it in this one. I think they might, but I love that they pray when they cast their spell.
Oh yeah, they chant and pray.
Yeah, I love that, and especially Final Fantasy IV with Porum and Palom and Rosa and all of them, when they're just like, they put their heads down and they're in the back row and they're praying.
Dude, it's so good.
And everyone's fighting around them. See, that's where the imagination comes from. Is like they're protecting them while they're casting. It's so dope, and I love that you and I share that about the imaginative nature of it. But the game is easy, and I think that is a problem. It's too easy to break it. The boss battles are categorically a joke. Like throughout the entire game, it's ridiculous.
So easy,
ridiculous, and I didn't remember that at all. And one thing I took away even more than anything, Dagan, is how busted the economy is. The economy in the game is busted. I had so much money and I wasn't doing anything. I was maybe grinding here and there. I did run around a little bit because I was getting the platinum, so I needed to fight every enemy. So some of them have rolls of like 1 in 64 or 1 in 100. So you have to kind of just run back and forth to encounter them. But I had so much money. There was and also there just seems to be so much equipment that you don't get much equipment in the game. Now it's a short game, so it reminds me a little bit more of the first Dragon Quest games, where it's like, okay, here are like 6 weapons and 4 pieces of armor and 2 shields or whatever. But I go in for more than that. It really blows open in 6 with that. But And obviously role-playing games are renowned now for their equipment and their management. But I find myself wanting that more. But again, you have to kind of look at it through the lens of 87, 86, 87 when they're making it. And it's so revolutionary and so interesting what they're doing. And they're kind of letting you, like you said, with Lodos War and other things, just kind of project your own, you might see the thief as Locke, or you might see whatever, project that onto the game. Of course, you wouldn't do that at that time. We're in reverse order there. But I like that they also embrace turn-based combat. And that's what I wanted to ask you is like, how do you feel about turn-based combat? Because I am kind of aghast about how people don't like it. I don't understand that. I'm like, so you like football? Football's turn-based.
Yes.
You most popular board game of all time, chess, turn-based. You guys talk about how you go and play poker with your friends, turn-based. I guess but then when it comes to video games, they're like, oh, I don't want a fucking turn-based video game. Like, what the fuck are you talking about? That's like the original way to play a game, going all the way back to time immemorial. And now it's projected in a digital form, and it's keeping track of all these stats, and it's much deeper than you just pressing buttons, generally speaking. I don't know. I'm really defensive of turn-based combat, and I get really annoyed that people poo-poo it as if it's just this really primitive way of playing, yet the biggest sport in the United States is a turn-based sport. And it just does, I just don't think people think about it like that. It's like I always say, Madden's a role-playing game. I think people just need to open their minds a little more to what these things actually mean, that maybe we're not as dynamic as we think, and that there are just more limited definitions for these things. And so I'm very curious, where do you stand on turn-based combat? Noting that we are in early Phantasy Star, Dragon Quest, Final Fantasy turn-based combat based entirely on speed. Final Fantasy IV and onward later would solve turn-based combat, in my opinion, for a lot of people by making it active. So, okay. You know what I mean? So like,
yes,
if you sat on the screen, I've said this many times, if you play Phantasy Star 1 or 2 or whatever, Final Fantasy 1, Dragon Quest 1, 2, 3, whatever, actually all the way up to 11 in that series, and you just leave your screen there when you're on combat, you can come back a day later and you're going to be there. If you start doing that in Final Fantasy 4, you'll be dead in like 2 minutes. Because the other side is taking turns based on their speed too, and they're not waiting for you anymore. So which I think was a brilliant coup de grace in that entire argument, and so we'll get to that later. But how do you feel about it the way we are playing it now?
I love it. I love turn-based combat. It does seem like it would be boring on its surface, but it never bothered me. I never really got bored. It never really got played out. I just always really adored it. That's why I wonder if people are judging it from afar without even trying it. I love bringing in sports and games as classic examples of exactly what turn-based. Anything, any sport, or any game.
170-year-old sport.
It's an age-old model, time-tested, proven over eras of just humanity. I've always loved it. I loved the whole turn-based thing and I love it in this game and games like it because it gives you a chance to, every time out, every battle, and there'll be many when you have random encounters like this especially, you get to, it really is the part of the game where you are playing a role. You get to decide what each party member is going to do based on their strength and based on that situation of how much MP they have, how much HP they have. Are they going to attack? Are they going to fight conventionally? Are they going to cast a spell, use an item, buff one of their teammates, another person in their party? Are they going to flee? Are they going to defend? You have to think about it. And the other really satisfying aspect of it, once you get into the rhythm of a specific JRPG, you could do it quickly. You could get into it. You could be more plotting and methodical if you need to. It really does. I think it really does put you into the experience. Again, in quotes, role playing, right? That's the part that I love. It really makes me think, though, going backwards for a second, I wonder, maybe not so much with the original, because I know Square was in desperation mode when they were making this game in the 80s, but especially with the pixel remasters, I'm not sure if this was the case, but it would be really funny if with Final Fantasy I specifically, it was kind of a come on, right? It was kind of a carrot on a stick saying like, oh, this is easy. You never played JRPGs before? Come in. And by the time you get to 6, they just take away all the nerfing. It's just like, you know what I mean? Now you got to really, I'm sure it's not. I'm sure we'll find all of these, that there'll be those quality of life upgrades or whatever. But which I'm kind of, I gotta say, a little bit nervous about with 4 and
Well,
6.
4 is interesting, Dig, because the little secret about 4 is that it was nerfed majorly when it was released on SNES and as 2. And we never got the true version of that game, I think, until the PS1 re-release that came with Chrono Trigger.
Oh, wow.
But for sure, when they remade it on 3DS or DS, regular DS, I wrote the strategy guide for that, actually, and that game was hard as fuck. So I wonder, like, seriously, you know, I don't even want to spoil it, but there's a last dungeon where you fight, I don't know if you remember, you fight like a bunch of different creatures as you go through the dungeon, and I'm like, this is insane. Yeah, I remember playing it at the time being like, this is insane. It wasn't like this. I was so intimately familiar with that game, and you could also do the... you remember when in the land of summons or whatever, you can actually like basically tape, I don't know what it was, like tape down your D-pad or something, or you could keep, you could just keep the summoners alive and keep killing the summons.
I didn't know at the time, but I found out.
And then you could just really nerf it that way. But so in other words, I think the version we're going to play is not the version we're used to.
Okay. Yeah, that makes me a little misty, but you know what, Kyle, you said this about the boss battles, and it's so true. For me, classic JRPG, going into a boss battle, not even a real big heavy, but like any boss battle, you were fucked. You felt like you were going to be fucked. And in fact, you were probably going to lose a couple of times at least. And maybe even go back to the beginning of that dungeon to learn about how am I going to deal with this guy? And do I have the health? Do I have the MP? Do I have the proper amount of items? Are my weapons upgraded sufficiently? That's what I loved about it. It gave you real sense of dread. I felt that all the way through the original Final Fantasy VII, where it was like, I'm going into this battle. I don't know if I'm coming out. You know, that's all taken away now. And, you know, this really kind of dovetails and plays into the argument. Are video games just too easy now? / will they make games, and there are exceptions in modern gaming, but will they make games that hard anymore? Is this just a new era of gaming? But that's what I really loved about it. And that's why I was shocked knowing Final Fantasies IV and VI specifically, and other things that I could, that are some of the Phantasy Star games. I love bringing that into the conversation. Wild Arms, at least the first couple, they were difficult. You were gonna run into a brick wall, especially with sometimes just with pedestrian enemies and dungeons and stuff, but specifically with the bosses. They were made to really test your skill and bring you to certain point, make sure you were leveled up to certain points to proceed in the game. So it had a logistical bent as well. Like if you're not ready, you're going to quickly find out you're not ready to get through this entire dungeon yet. And that's the one thing that's sort of lost. But I'm also kind of grateful that it was sort of JRPG light, in that we could get through it for the conversation in a timely, in a somewhat timely fashion.
Yeah, it'll be more demanding. The cadence of these episodes will slow down significantly when we get to the back half of them. But that's just necessary because, again, I don't want to play with any of that spoofing stuff either. Part of what I get into with JRPGs and part of what I don't like about this game is how short it is. But that's just the nature of the game. You really have to look at it through that lens. I sometimes think even games I love, like Red Dead Redemption 2, The Last of Us Part 2, these games are too long. But I do think I go into these kinds of games where I'm like, yeah, stay around for 60 hours. Stay around for even 80. When I platinumed Dragon Quest 11 in 2020, and that was insane. That was like 130 hours or something. And the game literally, I was hysterical laughing. And people that know and have played it know the game just ends like 3 different times where you're like, oh my God, maybe it's over now. And then it literally goes for 40 more hours, or something like that. It's like, oh my God.
That's insane. I always hear about that game. It looks wonderful. They're
awesome. If I love the Dragon Quest games, because here's what I love about Dragon Quest, and this is what I always tell people, and it seems like it might change with Dragon Quest 12 based on the logo, although we haven't seen anything from the game yet.
Okay.
And I hope they don't change anything. I really don't. But that game is just unabashedly the same game, right? It's like Pokemon. The games get bigger and different things happen and they're more dynamic and you're going to spend more time and maybe it's a little more interesting, but it's kind of the same. And Dragon Quest is just like, no, this is what it is. It's just mega turn-based and tons of things to do. And it's going to, God, man, I remember when Dragon Warrior 7 came to PS1, that was like 100-hour game back in the day when games were maybe 50, 60 hours in that genre specifically. But it's funny how Japanese role-playing games do fill these different niches, whether it's with Persona, which I think is really, really high quality and amazing. Trails of Cold Steel, which I really, really like as well. But the more traditional stuff I always take for. So Final Fantasy is like one step away, especially this Final Fantasy is like one step away from that traditionalist Dragon Quest stuff, which is cool. But
yeah.
And Phantasy Star as well. I'm always frustrated that Sega just doesn't bring Phantasy Star back. I don't know.
So strange.
Phantasy Star 5 has been a game people have wanted for, it's like 28 years ago Phantasy Star 4 came out.
That's insane. Beloved franchise.
Yeah. I mean, Phantasy Star Online people like, but it's not the same. It's not what I'm talking about. Phantasy Star was, I remember when I first played Phantasy Star 2, especially, I was like, wow, this is so interesting because
I love that game.
Because it's on Genesis, so it feels like you're a little, like it's something else, it's something different. But then the sci-fi, in other words, it feels just like the mirror image of Dragon Quest in all senses. And it's awesome. Yeah. It's super good.
I love it.
Shout out to Chris Kotter. He was always into those Phantasy Star games.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, he loved the Phantasy Star games, yeah. And Dragon Warrior. He was the one that got me into both of them. So
that's right. I remember that. Do remember that.
Yeah, he was like, oh my God, dude. Dragon Warrior. I would love for them to release those games more easily. I know they're on Switch, but at least 1 and 2, I think. And 3 is getting remade, which will be cool in that triangle strategy style or whatever. So yeah, that'll be pretty. What else do I have here in my notes? Yeah, let's get into some of the aesthetic and start with the art. Now, I don't want to judge the game's aesthetic as it is too much. We can maybe even judge it the way it was back then. But what I really wanted to get into, of course, with this is Amano. Yoshitaka Amano. One of the cool quality of life features in this version of Pixel Remasters, which is why I think it's so cool to get, is just the art galleries for the games. And there's something so... You might know the guys... You will definitely know the guy's name off the top of your head because I brought it up in a conversation previously with elsewhere and you weren't around. The guy that did the Star Wars art, but it didn't really look right, but it ended up being mega influential. Who was that?
Yeah, it's... God, give me a minute.
Rolo or something?
I gotta look it up.
Yeah,
he did all the conceptual art through the 70s and 80s.
Right.
My mind's going blank.
And so there's a guy, and Dagan will come up with the name. There's a guy that did Star Wars art that doesn't look like the final product, but is really influential on the final product. And
Ralph McQuarrie.
McQuarrie, that's what it was. And for this, I feel like Amano is kind of that. It's very interesting for me to imagine him presenting this art to people and then them making it into what they made it into. And I remember being younger and not really getting it. Amano's art was not what got me in when I was younger. It was other things, other elements to it. It wasn't until I got older that I really appreciated the deep sophistication of this man's art. And it's really incredible. Like I wonder what would you think a piece of Amano art would cost?
Dude, I had to check in on Amano when we did this game. I researched him for about an hour yesterday, and just to see what was what. He was the high. I just read this anecdote and I was blown away. In 96, and I don't know why they pegged this year specifically, all the way back in 96, he was apparently the highest paid commercial artist on planet Earth. He made $40 million just that year alone.
Wow.
On just prints of art that he had already done. So not even counting whatever commercial or non-commercial projects or whatever he was showing or exhibiting that year, just on existing art, he made that much. He is
so totally out of reach.
It's insane.
Yeah.
I mean, he's a luminary, but not just with video games and Final Fantasy specifically. We can't even imagine the franchise without him, but just in anime, in manga, fashion illustration and everything. It was such a bold choice, though, thinking back to a late 80s perspective, to use him on a game that required any sort of semblance of commercial success, because he has a very fine arts aesthetic. And I could see, you were 6 years old when this game came out. I could see people being really confused by this art style, especially when you think of a purely either D&D-esque comic book, manga, animation style, even fantasy, traditional fantasy illustration, whatever that was in the 80s, right? His stuff is a whole unique take and twist on all of that. It's like nothing else. It's very strange. It's a little androgynous. It has sort of femininity to it.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking. Yes,
it really is. Yeah. It incorporates that whole flavor. It's whimsical. It's elegant. It's not aggressive. Sometimes it's kind of horrific and odd, but still oddly beautiful. It's painterly. It's not what you think about in. Take somebody like Akira Toriyama, right? Who is the face of Dragon Quest. You could at least understand that. It's colorful. It's clear. It's graphic. It's a little bit badass. It's fun. It's cute in a way. It's very welcoming. There's a very low cost of entry. There's no barrier for entry with Amano's art. It's very sophisticated, especially for a kid, to understand like what exactly is this. I remember thinking that in my 20s. Like, I love it. I love how elegant it is. I love the color palettes. It's a little garish. It's flowing. It has weird choices in terms of detail and nuance. It's almost gaudily decorated. It's very strange for something that's supposed to be a badass fantasy series with warriors and wizards and all and horrific bad guys and dragons. But there's just something about it that I think gives it such a unique brand and a unique flavor that it's almost irresistible, and you get used to it. And after a while, I would say by Final Fantasy IV, Final Fantasy VI, 3 for us in the States, we were expecting it. It would be weird without it at that point. But to have that early on, to be Sakaguchi and say, I want this, which apparently I read an amazing anecdote. Somebody on the crew, on this little known crew at Square at the time, went to Sakaguchi and said, we should get this guy Amano to do the artwork. Check it out. He did this conceptual illustration for Gatchaman and Vampire Hunter D and gorgeous, just really gorgeous visual development art, watercolors and beautiful pen work. Really looks like traditional fashion illustration. And Amano was like, I absolutely don't, that's not what we need. That is, Amano felt like probably a 6-year-old at that time. Like, that's not right for this. And then skip a couple of beats, few frames, maybe it's like 2 weeks ahead. Amano goes to his crew and says, shows them a bunch of illustrations or something. And it's like, this is the guy I want. And they were like, yeah, that's Amano. So that's how it came to be. He absolutely kind of like deaded the entire concept and then went to them and was like, I want this guy. And they were like, yeah, that's the guy we suggested 2 weeks ago. Which is amazing.
It's crazy to think about just the logos themselves without that art, or like the telltale art. It's like a big deal when the game comes out and that art is revealed as to what it will be. I don't know if he did 16. He must have.
He had to have been involved. I know he left the company formally years ago, but he still freelances for them.
And you said the fashion. He has a fashion background, right? I mean, that's obvious.
I think his background was fashion illustration before he even got into anime with the big production houses in the that was probably mid to late 70s.
You can see that.
I mean, he was working on Speed Racer and stuff like that, apparently.
Oh, interesting.
From a visual development standpoint. So yeah,
you can see that though. I think later art, but like when you think about Edgar, Locke, like you could just see all the different. They're just beautifully dressed.
Yes,
and
it's the fashion. It's the visual cues and the trappings. Yeah,
and really even the Magitech armor, right? Even the Magitech armor and stuff. And we're getting way ahead, games ahead now, but where it's just it's all stylish. It almost looks like it's wearing clothes in some way. It's
true.
Yeah, it's good shit, man.
He really
he's great.
He brought that like nobody else in terms of making that just those telltale visual cues that no one else could have brought. You're right. I mean, a lot of that is down to not only the waifish figures and all of that kind of thing, but the clothing and the garments and the trappings and the armor and even the
weapons and stuff. Yeah, it's all great.
Beautiful.
Okay. The other thing we have to talk about here, of course, is the soundtrack. And we have Nobuo Uematsu.
Oh, man.
Doing the music here. It's funny. I was sitting on the main screen. Dun, 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 that. And it's I think it begins with 4 when it actually goes into that huge flourish that makes you want to fucking cry for some reason. I don't know if that's the nostalgia or just the sad nature of Final Fantasy IV. I was recently telling someone on a podcast that Final Fantasy IV is maybe one of the saddest games I've ever played.
It really is.
And like that, imagine that game remade in the remake, like the 7 style, but it was 4. And they didn't have to even do anything, but it was just that beautiful AAA $150 million game. But that story and Tella and Edge and all, oh my God, Fusoya.
Oh my God, so good.
Again, I'm getting too far ahead.
Cecil and Kane.
So yeah, it's amazing. Rydia, Rose,
Oh, my favorite. I love
Sid.
Rydia.
We're getting ahead. We're getting too far ahead. We're so eager to talk about them because those are the games that have stories. So that will be those episodes will be much deeper than this one will
well
be.
said.
But what do you think about the soundtrack? And hey, if you're playing the Pixel remaster, you have that whole redone orchestration, which is really cool. I think both versions of the songs are great. I think probably the originals make a little more sense when you play these, but that's fine. Whatever pleases you is fine with me. But the music is seminal, and he has the kind of audio arrangement thing locked down with Final Fantasy, very similar to the way Amano had the aesthetic locked down. I'm curious what you think of Uematsu.
Why does this music evoke such an emotional response? Like you said, is it nostalgia? Is it because it's beautiful? Look, Uematsu, he could have been the conductor of any philharmonic on the planet. The man is that talented musically, and he chose video games. And I love harkening back to this era of Sakaguchi and Amano and Uematsu being all together, this era. And I don't know if you noticed this, Kyle, there's a very classy ending frame of the closing credits of this game after you beat it, where Square Enix thanks the players past and present and thanks the original crew for creating these original games. And I thought it was such a classy tribute to people that, you have to remember, have been long gone from this company for years, but being acknowledged as starting the fire of what this franchise would become and how important it became in pop culture and nerd culture and video games. I thought that was so classy. And Uematsu is such a big part of that. And the fact that you could go back to this inflection point and realize they carried over these musical cues, maybe with the exception of a couple of the Final Fantasy iterations over the years, now that we're in the mid to late teens. But they use these musical cues as the foundational music for all the games moving forward. And of course, they embellished it and made it better and even more emotional and resounding later on. But I love going back, knowing the franchise so well, back to where it all started. And it is emotional. Even this version, which is very rudimentary and almost chiptune-like, even in the Pixel remaster, how much better it would get. But just knowing you're going back to this, where the seed was planted, it was just so cool. And the music throughout the game and the dungeon music and some of the boss music, of course, it'll get better as the games go on.
Oh man, it gets so good. I mean, it gets so crazy, especially on the SNES, essential. Because the orchestration can become much more complex with the MIDI format.
Good point.
It's just much more robust there. I actually think the 16-bit era is like the hallmark of Final Fantasy music. It's just incredible. Before they could really go balls to the wall, so they had to be really clever with the way they did things. But I love how they add on to that title track too. How it is just those chords up and down, or those notes really up and down. But then it turns into that huge orchestration. I think beginning with 4, and it's beautiful. It's wonderful.
It really is.
I'm not a bit. I don't get. I tell people this all the time that I don't really get into especially like orchestration, soundtrack, score with modern games very much, because it's not very important to me in modern games, because there are so many elements. And by modern games, I mean your more 3D A or AAA games. It's cool. There's good shit in there, and totally, I think a lot of it is like additive, where you don't even realize it's there, but if you removed it, you would notice, sort of thing. I think that with the score of a lot of movies too. I just don't have, even though I'm a musician, I don't have an ear for it, because it's not really what I'm looking for. I always tell people it's only in 2D games do I care about music, because it is such an important component of it, because there isn't a lot of dynamism in the graphical aesthetic, so you have to glean it from somewhere. And so I think that's why I think Mega Man music is so fucking gnarly. It's like, holy God. Yeah. And imagine playing those games without it. I mean, people do, I have many times, but it's iconic. Yeah. And they go together, and one without the other doesn't quite make sense. So I think the music's really important, becomes more and more important. And I like that they gave people the options of, using the original or using the newer arrangement. Dig, I wanted to ask you about a couple other things here, just kind of quirks of role-playing, I guess, or role-playing games. I wonder if this game, I was trying to think about this. This might be the earliest Japanese example of expanding accessibility of a world map based on the items you find. So like the boat, the canoe, the airship. I'm pretty sure this is the first game that does that. And that's pretty interesting because that's a trope of role-playing games.
Yeah.
And I actually kind of think a necessary one. One of the things that you have to kind of overlook in video games is, and I love this, and I love this kind of shit, is why am I fighting the weakest enemies when I'm weakest and the strongest enemies when I'm strongest? Like, why am I not walking out of town and just running immediately into a level 70 enemy, right? And just getting my shit wiped out. You can't really think about it in those terms because the game wouldn't work otherwise. And I think there's something about giving a person an explorable world, but it's not a Western role-playing game type thing where you walk out of Fallout 3's vault and it's like, all right, you can go anywhere you want if you can figure out how to do it and survive.
Right.
And this game's like, no, we kind of need to keep you on a path. You have the auspices of grandeur around you, but you can't quite access it yet. I'm pretty sure this is the first game of its kind to do that. And I'm wondering what you think of that. The idea of just, walking around, finding the boat, finding the canoe, finding the airship. Every role-playing game does it. It's
really interesting that this was really fundamental in exploring that new thing. And it's become a trope now, but this was the originator. I kind of love that. It is a part of the game, that sort of evolution of trudging along on foot. You're very limited by the topography, by the water, by the mountains, where you could go, and then slowly getting the ship, which makes you, opens up the world to you. You could go a lot more places, but you're still beholden to random encounters. The canoe, which allows you to go through narrower bodies of water, and then finally culminating in the airship, which frees you up from the shackles of random encounters if you want to be freed up. So really a great goal to get that airship. It's a sigh of relief that you don't have to, do. The random encounters are pretty insane if you don't shut them off. And again, I'd have them no other way. I mean, they are so, you're just kind of spammed with random encounters. There's just no way. They are incessant in this game. So really getting the airship is a great sigh of relief, and you really feel like you've evolved and you really feel like you're far along on your journey. And it changes the whole model of the gameplay too, because not only does it open up exploration, but it really can help speed things up, and you could sort of focus your goals in on not having to avoid certain areas and random encounters, or maybe enemies that are too powerful, stuff like that. One thing that bothered me though, Kyle, the canoe, right? You turn into this little gray man, just a little design nuance that I had a big problem with that somehow got through the art direction. Why can't they put the little cute character chibi head in the canoe? Why do you have to turn into this nondescript little gray guy in the canoe? It really bugged me. I was like, why is that ugly little gray guy? Why can't you just take the chibi head and put it on top of the canoe? In the boat. It'd be so much cuter.
Yeah, it would be. It would be. Yeah, we're still games away from character portraits even, which is interesting. True. And I love those. Yeah. I love the character portraits. Good. They're iconic. Hopefully they didn't fuck with those too much in these games.
That's Amano artwork. They wouldn't do that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's so yeah, we're still a little bit away from the even any sort of personalization of these people. And I named my characters Colin, Micah, Rush, and Treble. So I usually go with, they give you like suggestions, and when the characters are actually named later on, I never rename the characters when they're in like actual, when they actually give you a character. It's like, you want to name your character Locke? I'm like, yes. I'm not going to name my character because then I have no idea what the hell is going on. I always love that in games where you start renaming everyone. You have no idea what anyone's talking about anymore because you have no idea who's who. I also wanted to ask you, I don't think, I know for a fact that this isn't something Final Fantasy pioneered, but I think it's something Final Fantasy put an underline I guess, is backtracking. Now, we had the idea of backtracking in Zelda, Metroid, Castlevania 2, Faxanadu, whatever, so on and so forth. So it's not super new, but the idea of instantaneous access to any part of a map, especially when you have the airship, is something that's different. And another part of what I think makes Final Fantasy grand in some sense, in the classical historical sense of the word, when you're looking at it through that lens, that it's like, wow, every part of this game is active. You can actually go once you're like at the precipice of going to the last dungeon, You can take the airship anywhere and do anything. Go to all these different towns. There's a few side quests and optional things. You can go back and get treasure chests you couldn't open before. And it's all instantaneous and nonlinear. And I think that that's pretty extraordinary for the time. I'm wondering what you think of that, because the only examples we really had at the time of some sort of nonlinearity might be something like getting things out of order in Zelda, or eschewing certain things in a Zelda or a Metroid where you just don't get them. But when you think about the open world nature, in quotes, of a Castlevania 2, it's still linear. Yeah. It's just it's an illusion. So I think Final Fantasy removes that illusion, and I'm wondering, even though the quest obviously brings you in a linear fashion, I'm wondering what you make of that.
Yeah, you're right. This was way ahead of its time for that. You know what I loved about it playing now? Just the financial management. If you want to really cheap out, you could go to an early town and pay 30 gil a night rather than 200 gil a night.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
Right? You could, not that you had to nickel and dime in this game. I mean, I would get out of some of the middle and later dungeons. It was like $600,000.
Oh yeah, I had like so much. That's what I'm saying. The economy is busted. It sucks. I mean, that's because it makes the game too easy. Because once you can just trivially buy ethers and full potions and everything, it's like, well, what is even the point of this anymore? As opposed to in the later games where you're holding on to like the 3 ethers you find in the entire game, and you like end up never even using them.
Or God forbid you had a tent, you would never use it.
Yeah, no, yeah, never.
You know.
By the way, I never used a cabin, tent, or anything in the game the entire time.
No,
not
I
once.
never needed it.
Not once.
You never really need it.
You can't use it in the dungeons, and there's no save points in the dungeons, so it's useless. You know.
Absolutely, yeah. It kind of really makes them completely. Yeah, they're not. It's not necessary anymore. The thing that I realized too about the money management is not only that you always have so much. You always have so much gil at your disposal. The things you have to buy, most of the things you could get as far as items, weapons, and armor, you could get throughout the dungeons. But if you did have to buy something, they were so inexpensive anyway. Maybe you had to pay a total of 30 to 40,000 gil on your level 4 spell upgrades or something. You would have hundreds of thousands of gil left over for whatever. And then you would just keep accumulating money. Like you said, even if you 99 out all your items, all your ethers and your phoenix downs and your antidotes and your potions and high potions, which are expensive, you would have so much money left over. I did hear, and I didn't vet this for sure, but I did hear that they made the items a lot cheaper in the Pixel remasters than they were in the original 1990 version. Again, I didn't double check that, but I think that is one of the ways they nerfed.
I'm looking. People hear me typing in the background. I'm looking up what the specific changes were. So go on.
Yeah.
Go on.
Yeah. So I did read that it was harder in the original, and I do remember I couldn't see this being quite so easy. Again, those quality of life changes that make it, a little more accessible for our busy lives now, especially as adults. But yeah, I did read that economically it was a little tougher. It was a tougher go in the original. But yeah, I mean, the exploration was fun. Getting the airship is really satisfying in this because, again, I didn't really want to fuck with the random encounters, the repetition of the random encounters. I just feel like that's part of it. Like if they program that into the original, that's what you should have to deal with. They get a very traditional viewpoint on. And I'm an old man. I'm kind of entitled to that. But yeah, so what did you find out economically? Yeah, I'm talking about the armor upgrades. And specifically in the weapons, maybe even the spells. I think they cost more.
Yeah, here's all the differences. This is according to fandom.com.
Okay.
Pixel Remaster has a bunch of art differences.
Yeah.
Some of the sprites are lifted from Dawn of Souls, which was the PSP version, or maybe that was the Game Boy Advance version. I don't remember. Video filters for CRT, resolution stuff, obviously. Tap mode, that wouldn't even be for ours. That might be on Switch. I don't know. Switch isn't a touchscreen. That doesn't make any sense. So no, that would be new localization, auto battle, map system, diagonal movement.
Yep.
The option to display different characters when you're walking around. It would usually only be your leader.
Right.
Let's see. Gameplay. The charge system for spellcasting returns, removing the MP system. So yeah, we were right about that. The maximum character level remains 99. I think it was 50 in the original. Accuracy and evasion are represented on the character status screen by percentages rather than values. The intelligence stat affects the damage inflicted and health restored by spells.
Oh,
Price of items, equipment, and spells are based on the easy mode prices from the Origins version. So the Origins version is the PS1 re-release.
Oh,
So there you
easy
go.
mode.
A number of items are included from the Dawn of versions. Some area encounter tables have been returned to Origins versions. Petrified party members now gain experience. I noticed that, actually,
Oh,
because that's not a thing. In like, you didn't want your ending petrified would be like ending a battle dead in terms of getting experience. And dude, by the way, I was fucking so annoyed. I had everyone earning the same amount of experience, and then one of my characters died. And so everyone was off level from each other, and it
that
drove
happened
me
to me.
insane. And then I kind of when someone died in battle, I was less eager to even revive them, because I'm like, wow, I'll fuck everyone up so they can all be off. Because now that's better for my mind.
That same thing happened to me, and I was thinking of you because I was like, this happened to Colin. It would drive him crazy too. The only way to remedy that really is to kill the other three and just fight with that one character, right? Until they got some sort of equanimity. But I guess that would be almost
impossible.
Be so hard.
That would be funny, dude, because you could probably look at the tables for experience and figure out how you would arrive at a number, like with everyone doing it. And I'm sure that would be a funny YouTube video, actually, and probably drive me crazy if I ever tried to do it. So the other thing that I thought was cool in this new version, as I said earlier, was the bestiary. I just like looking at enemy encounters. It annoys me, and it's obviously a storage issue in the early NES and SNES games, but just the inability to see who you fought, what their stats are. For instance, in a Final Fantasy IV and a Final Fantasy VI, you can cast, whatever it is, Libra, to see what the enemy stats are, but there's no way to look at that beyond being in battle with them and kind of knowing and absorbing that and knowing that in the moment. So you'd actually have to cast it over and over again if you wanted to be reminded of that information, which is interesting and maybe a little bit more realistic. But I like that with no memory constraints, they can finally include these sort of bestiaries and these complex appendices that I think go really hand in hand. It's like Tolkien. You kind of want this sort of stuff. And I don't think any of the enemies really stick out as anything interesting or special to me in this game. It's just cool because again, we're far away from having really cool villains and memorable lieutenant enemies, and we're like so far away from that.
Yes.
And
still a ways out.
Yeah. So I think that really begins kind of in 3 and certainly in 4. So we'll get to those. But in the meantime, it's cool to just go and look at that stuff and see what they look like. I love pixel art, man. I love looking at it. I like seeing how they did it, the animations, and on the screen of watching little chibi characters move and watching them just advance, and the weapon you see the weapon appear and it hits, and then it's so cute. And yet there's such seriousness about it. So did you get a chance to explore the bestiary or any of the other kind of things that are included?
Yeah, I love having all that at your disposal and seeing all the pixel art. It's Amano pixel art. You have to appreciate that. I did like the look of the 4 elemental fiends. They were pretty cool, especially Tiamat. Then seeing Tiamat, the legendary multi-headed dragon, pop up in this. Talk about D&D. I mean, that's directly taken from D&D. And they kept it in, which I was surprised about. And I like Garland too. Garland's pretty cool. I mean, he's a pretty one-dimensional enemy. He's not what we'll get later on with some of the epic Final Fantasy enemies, but I like the way he kind of looks like a golden Bahamut Zero, and he's kind of got Unicron's head, and he just looks he's got the dragon tail. He looked really cool. I wish we could have got more of Garland throughout. Like maybe he would encounter, or we could just cut away to what he's doing just to get more of him. Again, he's very, he's got that traditional big bad role where he comes in at the end, and that's about it. But it would have been cool to have a little more Darth Vader with that character.
Yeah,
you know what?
I'm sorry. Go ahead. Please.
No. Go, please.
No.
Please.
I was just gonna say, like, it's very early Dragon Warrior 2, where you're just doing what you need to do to get to the next thing, to get to the next thing, to get to the next thing. There seems to be no point. Like at one point in this game, you're like using TNT or something with dwarves. Yeah. I have like no idea what the fuck. You're fighting a dark elf for some people, and they just don't flesh it out enough. It's too bad, because there really was no space constraint for them to. It's a time and place thing, though. Yes. They didn't have to show anything else. You just have more of an exposition, and it is funny because there is that one scroll of an exposition, in the game, and I'm like, and that's like so long. I'm like, all right, yes, I get it. It's like, all right. Like you didn't even bother to say anything the entire game, and then you're going into this huge scroll. I'm like, I'm over it. I don't care.
By the way, that scroll is confusing, dude, and it contradicts itself. The English translation is well written. The localization is well written, but it just doesn't make any sense. It's actually really confusing. And you're right. That's really well said. The final boss in these type of games is the next thing, just with no next thing. You know, like the final boss, that's all it is the ultimate thing to get to, but there's just nothing else. That's the only thing that sets it apart from the rest of the
isn't the story about time travel or something?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. The whole thing is the whole thing was about time travel going back 2,000 years because Garland started this perpetual time loop where even if you defeat him and his fiends, he just keeps coming back. But the heroes stop it, but by stopping it, it never happened. And they never existed. So no one will ever hear this story. But I'm paraphrasing, but what it says in the end is nobody will ever hear this story, but we'll always remember this story. It's so weird as fucking. It's like, wait, what? It also says this is the start of fantasy and this ancient world that dwarves and dragons and elves inhabited. So it's an answer to like the whole fantasy genre, which is kind of an interesting thing. But then it goes on to say like these heroes never existed, and that's tragic. Also, you'll never remember them, but everyone will always remember them. It's like really, it's really crazy. You know what I did? I was very impressed about one thing with this game though, and it reminded me of the JRPGs or just fantasy that I'm most attracted to. I think of things like Phantasy Star, in fact, which are very sci-fi heavy, and taking the trappings of fantasy and kind of blending them with sci-fi, maybe cyberpunk. This game did that very early on. You have mermaids, you have vampires, you have airships, submarines, robots, laser guns, and then, you know, various technological elements later on. And you're kind of mashing that up with dwarves and elves and dragons and towns and wizards and all the traditional fantasy trappings. I just love mixing that all up. It feels very contemporary. And I'm thinking about from a mid-'80s standpoint when this came out in Japan finally in 87, like that was a very early time to incorporate things like that all together. Nobody was doing that. So I loved being, you know, you could tell there were some fantasy nerds at Square at the time and putting in things like dark elves, because very few people outside of the D&D realm even knew what the hell that was. So they were kind of, you know, just kind of putting in their own nerdy delights into there, right? And also just mixing up everything. And I think it was part of the beginnings of that was making it acceptable to mash all those things together. Horror elements, sci-fi, cyberpunk, really future tech and fantasy, and really primitive stuff too, that maybe even would predate fantasy, men with spears type of thing. I love putting all that stuff together because it really could build these sort of boundless imaginative worlds where anything goes. And if it's fantasy anyway, who gives a shit? Put a spaceship in with a dragon, right? I love stuff like that. And, you know, that reminds me of things that really, from an art direction standpoint, were so impressive, like Final Fantasy VII. But this was the beginning of that.
Yeah, I was looking up because I actually was like, who wrote the original Final Fantasy? I never even looked, because Kazushige Nojima becomes who is well known as the Final Fantasy writer later, beginning really with 7, and I think he even wrote 16.
Oh wow!
But he wrote. I'm looking now. He wrote 15 and 7. He's working on the 7 remake and Rebirth and all that kind of stuff. So 16's by someone else, which is fine. But Kenji Terada is the guy who's now 70 years old. He wrote Final Fantasy 1, 2, and 3. The original 1, 2, and 3, and worked on some other stuff as well. So yeah, he put the stuff together. It's different. I mean, and they call it scenario writing in Japan, of course, but
nice. I love that. The world building and Greek mythology, you're kind of putting in everything you want, you know. It's very what do you say? It's very self-indulgent in a way, but I love it. And this was, I can't think of an earlier work of fantasy that had all of those things combined. Almost completely undisciplined. It's like, just put this in too. It's like this boundless recipe that just works. And it's fun. I was so impressed with that. I was not expecting that. I was expecting very traditional fantasy in the ways of Lord of the Rings. I thought Lord of the Rings was really going to be the shepherd for this, and anything outside of that would have been something that came later, but started back then.
I wanted to end with, unless there's anything else you wanted to touch on, which we of course can, but I wanted to end with this question, which is, how has Final Fantasy remained relevant? We're recording and publishing this on the verge of Final Fantasy 16, which is one of the most anticipated games of the generation so far, and looks totally amazing with an entirely new leadership team really doing it. In, of course, Yoshi P, who is the guy who is lauded as saving Final Fantasy XIV and was actually playing Zelda on his Final Fantasy 16 Square Enix stream a few days ago, and it was written about because he couldn't stop playing Zelda, even though he's talking about a PS5 game.
Fucking love that.
Yeah, like, just doesn't even care. But people are really excited about that game. And I think what's interesting to me is that I can only name 2 franchises in gaming, Mario and Zelda, and I think Zelda would be even questionable in some sense, that has remained truly at a high level relevant the entire time since not its origins, because Mario is older than Super Mario Brothers, but from Super Mario Brothers onward, so let's say 85 onward, from a seminal game, whatever it is, it remains truly relevant. And if you look at any low point in quotes of Mario, you might look at it as something like Sunshine or maybe the early DS era, which still had New Super Mario Brothers and other things. So I don't, or that was what it was called, right? No, Super Mario Brothers DS or whatever was that was the first one that popped. Remember, it was like the launch game for it. I loved that game. I played it at fucking Jury Duty. That's what I remember about it. And I was just thinking that day that I don't know that Final Fantasy has remained truly mega relevant the entire time, but it's got to be up there. And I'm wondering what it is about it that keeps it relevant. The 16 games are truly different. Final Fantasy really should be looked at more as an anthology than anything else, with game over game sequels that are numbered as such. So for instance, Final Fantasy IV gets Final Fantasy IV the After Years, and those are connected. Final Fantasy VII gets Crisis Core and Dirge of Cerberus and all those things because they're numbered. And Final Fantasy X gets 10-2, and Final Fantasy 13 gets 2 and 3, and so on and so forth. But it's really more of a Black Mirror like anthology, or a Twilight Zone like anthology of stories. And people still care. Final Fantasy 16 will sell millions of copies. Now, it's not going to do Zelda numbers. It's not going to do Mario numbers. None of them really ever have since 7. But I wonder what you make of its continued success, and the I think most potent part of it right now, which is that 16 seems to be very much going back to the brimstone swords and fucking shields and dragons and all of that of the first one.
I love that. I love going back to that. I think it's time. I think it's a good time for that. You always have to, something like Final Fantasy, a legendary franchise like this. What is the lightning in the bottle? Why is it such a storied thing? Why does it have such a dedicated following? Sometimes it's hard to articulate that. With Final Fantasy, it's interesting. You have the familiar title, that's the umbrella. And then typically in a perfect world, hopefully with each one, you tell an amazing story, and through that or by that, you get to take control of a memorable party of characters that you care about and sort of take them, play as them, go along on a journey with them, and in a very satisfying way. And what I love about it is not only having all those elements, the story, the characters, something you want to be a part of for 40 plus hours with every iteration, is the fact that they change it every time. They like Nintendo with something like Mario, with something like Zelda. They never really, it always seems the least successful when they try to go back and duplicate their success with something rather than try something new. I like the inventiveness of doing something new, telling a new story with new characters, building new worlds every time out. And really, aside from some of the small trappings like musical cues and stuff, or chocobos and things like that, is the fact that it's a new thing every time. Final Fantasy is the only constant, that title, that umbrella title. So, and I think probably because the best of them, 4, 6, 7, whatever you would argue beyond that are your favorites, I think they're the outings that create the success or make people want to come back for more. Even if, let's say, you really loved 7 and you didn't really care for 8 and 9 that much, maybe by the time 10 comes out, you're like, okay, they're going to eventually they have to come around and do something great again. So just having a few successes, I think, goes a long way with something like Final Fantasy. And I think it's probably really hard with a game that's going to be that sort of investment. This isn't Donkey Kong. You don't pop a quarter in and play for 12 minutes or something. You got to be invested in these for hours. And I think oftentimes, although I haven't played all of them, the work put in and the thought put in reflects that from an art standpoint, from a visual dynamic, story, playability, and all of those type of things. And also evolution. Doing something new. What can we capitalize on? What do we reincorporate this time that worked? And how do we kind of freshen that up or put a new spin on that or a new perspective? I kind of dig that. And it makes me lament not paying attention to the more modern Final Fantasy games, but playing the old ones oddly makes me want to turn to the new ones and say, let me give these a shot. It's still Final Fantasy. It's still, technology has changed, but it's still kind of the same idea, even dating back to the late 80s, early 90s. So, who knows? Maybe time is of the essence, but it is interesting to think of what makes something perpetual or evergreen and why do other things die or fall by the wayside? It's a toughie. But it is cool. I love when things last this long for decades, where there's a real legacy and a real passing of the baton to younger players too, where really I think of the young video gamers now, they could go back and discover, maybe they jump into a Final Fantasy 14 or 15 or whatever, and then they could go back. There's entire hours and hours, years maybe of games to discover going back. So to have something go on for that long is always cool. I think of something like The Simpsons or something that just has staying power and, keeps and stays good, stays at a certain level, doesn't jump the shark, doesn't become old hat or rote, something that people still look forward to. So I think the proof's in the pudding. If people are still buying the games, then God bless them. They're doing something right.
They are. It's interesting because, it also speaks to, I think, Final Fantasy's kind of Western appeal and the international appeal that Dragon Quest just kind of lacks outside of the niche anime or role-playing game fan base that will never play a Dragon Quest game. And Dragon Quest is older, so it's funny. And that series is much more important in Japan than Final Fantasy is. And so
yeah, sure.
I think that you could even make an argument that a game like Persona would be as important as Final Fantasy is in Japan. And so it's funny to just see that cultural difference as well, which is why I want to see what they do with Dragon Quest 12. Because, of course, Dragon Quest 10 was an MMO on Wii, never released here. And that was a really weird thing for them to do to Dragon Quest because it really never had changed very much. They did jump around very agnostically from platform to platform, which I thought was kind of cool, actually. But because they were always, it was like it was Famicom, Super Famicom, Super Famicom, Super Famicom. No, Super Famicom twice. PlayStation, okay. PlayStation 2, okay. DS, Wii, PS4, right? That's the order their games had come out. So they dance with different partners, and I like that. But I'll be very interested to see what Dragon Quest 12 is all about because we need that sense of traditional role playing that doesn't need to change very much because people like that. But I'm sure now that these two once rival companies are with each other, and they have been for 20 years, that they can really have the best of both worlds and do it both ways. And it's funny because we're talking about Final Fantasy I, where a lot of the traditional stuff, like they've gone back and renamed the spells to line them up, but things like that weren't really there yet. Chocobos aren't there. I have my Cactar behind me. He's not there yet. He's a long way off still. So there are still things, and I love that. That's what I love about Tales and some of the other games where there are binding elements that make them feel like they're in the same series, but they're not in the same universes even. And so in Tales, a lot of it is like spell names, item names, money, and they do that in a lot of Final Fantasy games. So, but I wish you and I had more time because there's a wealth of Japanese role playing games that I think you would be really interested in. They're just so time consuming. Like I brought up earlier, Falcom's Trails of Cold Steel series. Those are the guys that do East, which is still going on as well.
Right,
East
that's
9
right.
came out recently, or East 10, I think, was announced.
Jeez, that's another one.
But that's more of an action RPG. But Trails of Cold Steel and all those kinds of games are really good and very deep, political, class-based. I don't mean class like Final Fantasy. I mean like class, like political class-based, about the haves and have-nots and poor people and rich people. And the Persona games are these really deep, complex stories about kids and teens in high school, and they're awesome.
I want to play those badly, actually.
Persona. I only played Persona 4 and I loved it. I was like, this is extraordinary. This is an extraordinarily good game. The music is amazing. The characters are very memorable. Very Japanese, very traditional in terms of its role playing, but it all is based on a calendar. So you have to make choices every day. It's like, today I'm going to go to work. Today I'm going to go study. I'm going to go to a dungeon today, but then I'm going to go hang out with someone, which will make my social link with them better. But you have to make choices, and the calendar just goes and goes and goes. So you can't do everything you want to do, which part of that really frustrates and puts me off. But once I overcame that, and I actually play with a walkthrough, which allays my fear of missing things, because I fucking hate that. When I go and look at a trophy guide and I look at it, and first thing I look at is like missable trophies. If it says 0, I don't care. I just play the game however I want. But if it says that there's missable trophies, then I have to figure out what you can miss and all of that, because it bothers me that I can miss things. I don't like missing things.
No.
And so you have to play, for people like me with that kind of OCD, you have to play Persona with a guide. But if you do, you play with a spoiler-free guide. It's no big deal. All these things happen in a day, and it'll say like, go to work. May 16th, go to work. And then that's all it'll say. And then everything will happen the way it's supposed to happen, so you can experience everything. And
I love that.
As long as I can do that, which I can, thanks to the internet, those games will be very accessible and interesting to me too. So I just wish you had more time, because there's so much interesting just in that genre that I think you've missed. And I frankly don't think you've missed that much, though, because Japanese role-playing games were fucking awful for, I would say, solid 2 generations.
It seems like that. Or you don't hear from much out of the JRPG camp from that specific era. You don't hear very much. Persona is interesting, though, because I know I'll love it. It's definitely one of my biggest laments. It's something that's on the top of my wish list. But how the hell has that stayed out of the other entertainment spaces? Why are they not making movies and shit like that?
I think they do. I think there's an anime, but it's a very Japanese series. I think that they're unapologetically, it's not accessible. I
love that about it, though. That's cool.
It's like very, made by Atlas Studio.
That's right.
The guys that did Catherine as well. And they did Catherine in between Persona 4 and Persona 5.
We have that on our list.
Yeah, we'll definitely get to that game as well.
Yeah,
you'll love that game.
that one.
You'll absolutely love that game.
I have that right there, actually.
But it's interesting to think about all of the different opportunities for great JRPGs. And of course, Western role-playing games are doing their thing too, although I'm not as into them. There was I had a moment with Mass Effect. I had a moment with Fallout. I never really had a moment with the Elder Scrolls. There's something just about Japanese games that I'm just much more intrigued by. I'll take Square Enix over Bethesda any day of the week. Personally, most people would not say that, but I absolutely would. I love their stuff.
You're really steeped in that tradition. You know what else it is with Square Enix, though, Kyle? It's style. With Final Fantasy specifically, and I think this can't be understated. It's style. If you're good, there's always style. They're really high on that, and I'm not just talking about Amano or visual cues, but there's a very specific flavor. There's a very specific style. It's very high styled. I would say the same thing about much older things like Phantasy Star. I always felt that about Phantasy Star, even
Definitely.
from afar, because I haven't played very much outside of 2. But I always felt like it was a very specific style. It was stylish. And I think that's a big part of Final Fantasy VII. That's what really captured my imagination about the earlier iterations all the way through 7 was how bold they were in terms of style and presentation. As good as any work of fiction across books, movies, TV shows. Think about, we talk about epic, essential works of fantasy, Game of Thrones, right? Just as good, just as brilliant art direction. Any Final Fantasy game that, from my knowledge, has had that very decided style, very specific, just really, and just very high quality in terms of style. Not just gameplay, not just character, not just story experience, game design, but really style is an important part of that. And I think that probably, when you have such a specific brand like Dragon Quest, or Final Fantasy, it's probably really hard to break into that space and compete, I would imagine, when there's already people in that space that are so good at it. And they're also not, by the way, not hurt by that legacy. But each of those things especially have a long legacy. But other things, like you mentioned too, like ease, that's an important one.
Yeah, Tales, I think, is an important one.
Tales,
it's crazy. Tales will be 30 years old in 2025. It's an old series.
That's crazy.
Yeah, the Falcon, I mean, East is from TurboGrafx. I mean, that's an ancient series. And then you think about the things that kind of went away or don't exist anymore in the same sense. Like, where is Ultima? Where is Wizardry? I don't even know who owns that shit anymore. I know that they continue to release some stuff, but it's not. You would think someone would coalesce and say, like, we're going to make a $200 million Ultima game called Ultima. Yeah, but on the other hand, it's like, who gives a shit? I mean, maybe it's just over. I don't know.
They were building blocks,
right.
But you would think those people would say, can we incorporate those building blocks? Maybe we could get that and make it new and just sort of as a tribute or something,
Yeah, I'd be all over an IP like that, man. I mean, that's so cool. Arguably the first role-playing game on computer. So it would be, as we kind of understand it, it's very primitive. You're moving around blocks and it's kind of weird. And of course, all the dungeon crawling stuff is interesting too. That's a genre I never got mega deep into, like Shadowrun and
me either.
I played a few of those games, and there was actually a pretty. I mean, everything was small on Vita, but there was a niche on Vita that played dungeon crawlers. There were a lot of those kinds of first-person dungeon crawling games that were released on that platform. And so I was going to say about role-playing games, it's funny because you have your Square Enix at the top, right? With, in my opinion, Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest, and then of course Sega with Atlas and with Persona up there as well. But then you have Bandai Namco. They're kind of doing their thing with Tales and a few other things, Ni no Kuni and some other stuff.
I forgot about Ni no Kuni.
And then you have the publishers like NIS and Xseed that I think are happy to sell 100,000 copies of their game and just localize it and make a little chunk of change and move on. And so I will say that I feel like the game of the world, it's easier to make games, but becoming more expensive in some ways to make games that people care about. So I think that middle ground of role-playing games has kind of disappeared. And because I would say the later PS2 era into most of the PS3 era, role-playing games, Japanese role-playing games were really bad. For the most part. I mean, there was very few exceptions.
Yeah.
But we're in a different place now. And a lot of that has to do with this very company, Squaresoft, that I think is doing a great job, maybe not managing their catalog the best. They're releasing their games on top of each other. And I don't really know what the point is of their release schedule, but they have a lot of high quality stuff, awesome IP. They recently released an ActRaiser game and a Tactics Ogre game, and it's cool, man. I mean, they got a lot of good shit going on. Crisis Core got re-released. We have the Final Fantasy VII Remake continuing with Part 2 this winter, Final Fantasy 16 on the precipice, Dragon Quest 12, hopefully we'll learn more about this year. So they are certainly a titan in the space, and they'll have their way with most of the Japanese role-playing games community's money for a while until inevitably Persona 6 is announced and starts to suck up some of that oxygen, I think, as well. But who knows when that's going to happen? I don't have any idea.
Yeah.
All right, Dave. That's all we have for this episode. Are we satiated on Final Fantasy 1? It's time to move on to 2.
I did have to tell you one story, and Please. I'm a little embarrassed because we've been talking this entire conversation about how easy the game is, and I do think it's easy. I almost texted you this night. I was about 4 or 5 hours into the game. I was in one of the earlier dungeons. I don't know if it was the cave, the cavern cave, or the volcano. I don't remember exactly, but it was a tougher one. This game has a weird rhythm, at least the Pixel Remaster did, where it started harder and got easier. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that was a matter of leveling up and just having items and weapons and armor available to you later in the game, but I feel like it started harder and got easier, which was a kind of a weird...
I agree.
Right?
Usually games start, like a role-playing game that starts pretty hard, gets easier, and then ramps up. So it's like a spike in the beginning, then goes down, and then starts to go up.
Pretty typical arc.
Right.
This one was a little different. But early on, I did the thing, and I'm a relatively experienced JRPGer, although it's been a while. I was in this dungeon. I made my way through. I made the mistake of not accumulating enough items. Like I didn't have enough ether. I didn't really have enough high potions, stuff like that. I was draining my items. It was before I could really do a lot with my white magic where I could cure or heal or bring back, use your Phoenix down spells and all that kind of thing. So that wasn't an option. But it was also before teleport or leaving dungeons easily. So I had to make my way back out of the dungeon. And I think there was one enemy that was one hit killing or spell casting my party. I was down to one person, and I couldn't make it out of this dungeon. And I didn't have a backup slot going into the dungeon, like is typical practice. Before, you don't know what you're going to encounter in here. Is it going to be easy? Is it going to be hard? Do a backup slot so you could always start over if things go awry. I didn't do that. I almost didn't make my way out. I had one party member to make my way out because everybody else was dead. So my quick save just kept returning to that person. I finally made it out by literally moving 3 or 4 steps before I had a random encounter and saving. So and it took me hours. And this might have been a time sink for me. And that speaks to the total 25 hours. I thought that night I was going to have to start over and lose 5 hours. And I was like, you're an experienced JRPGer. And not only that, this game is pretty easy. How can you fuck up this bad? So I almost texted you that night. I was like, dude, I just had the biggest scare I've had in gaming in decades, where I was like, oh my God, I'm going to have to do this over because there's no other way. I had no other save slot. So even an experienced gamer with an easy game could make mistakes. The other thing that surprised me in terms of sophistication was the party evolving. That shocked me. You go visit Bahamut, right? He gives you your class upgrade. And it is intimated that the characters are kids. And they physically, your little sprites grow up. And I was like, what the... I was shocked by it. I was a little sad to see the little cute chibi sprites go because they look a lot older with their little smaller heads and everything. The trade-off, though, was my thief becoming a ninja.
Yeah, super cool.
Loved it. And one of my OCDs, we talked about who plays JRPGs, and I wonder how much of that has to do with a certain brand of OCD. But I have this one OCD, like you're saying, you can't rename your party members if they're given names. I have a thing where I can't play on the overworld as anybody but the leader. I don't know why. I just can't do it. I can't walk around. I love the black mage, but I can't walk around. He's not the leader.
Yeah, right. Totally.
So that's one of my OCDs, but having the ninja convinced me. I walked around as the ninja once my thief became a ninja because I just had to look at my little red ninja guy.
Yeah, because I think I was actually kind of mad because I picked the monk in the beginning, and so I think he turns into the black belt. And I was like, God damn, it would have been cool to have. I mean, he's really powerful, but it would have been cool to have the ninja. We all love the ninja, and we'll see more of the ninja in Edge in Final Fantasy IV and Shadow and Final Fantasy VI and elsewhere. Of course, got to have the ninja. It's so weird, like the ninja character. It's so strange. It's like a Final Fantasy thing too.
That's the other thing. Yeah. Incorporating ninjas with your mermaids and your robots and there. It's like everything. Let's just have everything.
It's fun.
Love it.
It works. Well, Dave, let's end this episode with a dad joke like we always do with KnockBack.
We got our sister Allie's. Now, a lot of people have been writing in dad jokes more than ever. I would say more than ever over the last 5 years, which is interesting. And I'll start reading them. I'm collecting them on my DMs. I didn't forget you guys. But we're going to go with the cards. This is a terrible one. All right. We got 2 vegetable jokes in a row. This is weird, but I'll just read the one.
Yeah.
I'll just read the one.
Yeah, please one. Yeah.
Kyle, what vegetable is kind to everyone?
I don't know.
This is like preschool level. The sweet potato.
That's pretty good.
I always forget potatoes are vegetables.
Yeah, I guess they are. They're like tubers or whatever. Right? Yeah.
Tuber.
Oh. A-tone. You trying to tell me that entire orchestra is trans? All right. Dagan, that was Final Fantasy I. Everyone can go play it and should play it if you have the time and inclination. You can play it on the NES Classic, PC, phone, both iOS and Android.
That's right.
Game
Wonder
Boy,
Swan.
Yeah, Wonder Swan. Game Boy. Yeah. If you have your Wonder Swan, your Bandai Wonder Swan. Game Boy Advance. Let me see what else. No, not DS. I guess it's
Wii Virtual Console.
Yeah, it's on Virtual Console for Wii, Wii U, 3DS.
God.
PS4, Switch, PC.
I love playing it on the Switch. I love playing the PC.
I imagine that's probably the best way to play it.
So fun.
Yeah.
Really kind of a flawless presentation. And again, you can make it as traditional or as, sped up. You want the quality of life. You want to be a wimp. You want to do the You want to do the quality of life things and beat it. And I think I saw a Let's Play. It took me 25 hours. How is somebody Let's Playing this game? I know they may be very familiar with it. 4 hours, though? It's not even edited, I checked. That's just embarrassing. For me, not for the other person.
Yeah, 25 hours is pretty excessive, but I would imagine you probably let your clock run at some point
I don't know
to get that number. That seems seems unthinkable. In some sense.
So Dagan.
Well, Dagan, thank you for being here with me. Appreciate your time. And
so fun.
Thank you all out there for your love, kindness, and support of all things KnockBack. We appreciate you. Couldn't do it without you. Whether you support us on Patreon, patreon.com/laststandmedia, or of course on free feeds, audio, and YouTube. Thank you again. We'll see you next time. Until then, goodbye. KnockBack, a retro and nostalgia podcast, is a product and trademark of Last Stand Media and Collins Last Stand LLC, and is recorded from Central Virginia and the Philadelphia suburbs, USA. The show was conceived by and is produced by me, Colin Moriarty. My co-host is Dagan Moriarty. KnockBack's executive producer is Dustin Furman, and the show is edited by associate producer Ben Smith. All of Last Stand's theme music is by Ramon Narvaez. As you know, all of Last Stand Media's shows, including KnockBack, are fan-funded on Patreon at patreon.com/laststandmedia. The following names are at the producer support level or higher on Patreon, and we're grateful for your kindness and generosity.